Now, the Sunday Politics has had sight of a major new report into Islamist terrorism in the UK. This is it here. It's a 1,000-page study. Researchers say it's the most comprehensive ever produced. It's certainly very heavy. It analyses all 269 Islamist-related terrorist offences committed between 1998 and 2015. Most planned attacks were thankfully thwarted. But what can we learn from those offences? Here's Adam Fleming.
For the police and the intelligence agencies to fight terror, they need to know what it is. Researchers at the security think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, gave us early access to their huge new report, which analyses every Islamism-related attack and prosecution in the UK since 1998. That's 269 cases involving 253 perpetrators.
With issues as sensitive as counter-terrorism and counter-radicalisation, it's really important to have an evidence base from which you draw policy and policing, and that's exactly what this is. This isn't my opinion, this is the facts.
This chart shows the number of cases each year, combined with the small number of successful suicide attacks. Notice the peak in the middle of the last decade, around the time of the 7/7 bombings in London in 2005. Offences tailed off before rising again from 2010, when a 3-year period accounted for a third of all the terrorism cases since the researchers started counting.
What we're seeing is a combination of both more offending in terms of the threat increasing. We know that from the security services and police statements, but also I believe that we're getting more efficient in terms of our policing and we're actually prosecuting more people.
Prosecuting them for what? Around a third of people were found to have facilitated terrorism. That's providing encouragement, documents, money. About 18% of people were aspirational terrorists, interested but going no further. 12% of convictions were related to travel, to training camps or war zones, a crime that's increasing. And 37% of people were convicted of planning attacks, although the methods have changed over time.
5 or 6 years ago, we saw a lot of people planning or attempting pipe bombs, and most of the time they had Inspire magazine in their possession. That's a magazine, an Al-Qaeda English language online magazine that had specific pipe bomb instructions. More recently, we've seen Islamic State encouraging people to engage in lower tech, knife, beheading, stabbings attacks, and I think that's why we've seen that more recently.
Shasta Khan plotted with her husband to bomb the Jewish community in Manchester. In 2012, she received an 8-year prison sentence. She's one of an increasing number of women convicted of an Islamism-related offence, although it's still overwhelmingly a crime carried out by men in their 20s. Despite fears of foreign terrorists, the report says the vast majority are British-born. Most had their home in London, around 43% of them. 18% lived in the West Midlands, particularly in Birmingham, and the North West is another hotspot, with around 10% of cases coming from there. Richard Dart lived in Weymouth and tried to attend a terrorist training camp abroad. He was a convert to Islam, as were 16% of the people in this report. Like the majority of cases, he had a family, a network. A quarter lived with their parents.
What's particularly interesting is how different each story is in many ways, but that then within those differences are certain commonalities and types. So your angry young men, in the one sense, inspired to travel, seek training and combat experience abroad, and then the older recruiter, father figure types, the fundraising facilitator types. There are types within this terrorism picture, but the range of backgrounds and experiences is huge.
And 3/4 of those convicted of Islamist terrorism were on the radar of the authorities because they had a previous criminal record, they'd made their extremism public, or because MI5 had them under surveillance.
And to discuss the findings of this report, the former Security Minister Pauline Neville-Jones, Adam Dean from the anti-extremist group, the Quilliam Foundation, and Talha Hamed from the Muslim Council of Britain. Talha Hamed, let me come to you first. The report finds that the more segregated and isolated a Muslim community is, the more likely it is to incubate Islamist terrorists. What's the MCB doing to encourage more integrated communities?
Well, Andrew, MCB's track record on calling for reaching out to the wider society and having a more integrated and cohesive society, I think is a pretty strong one. So one of the things that we are doing, for example, very recently I've seen, we had this Visit My Mosque initiative. The idea was that mosques become open to inviting people of other faith and their neighbors to come. And so we were really encouraged to see so many mosques participating. Now, it doesn't address the issue properly, but it is one step forward.
But is it a good thing or a bad thing that in a number of Muslim communities, the Muslim population is over 60% of the community?
Well, Andrew, I personally and the Council would prefer to have a more mixed communities, but one of the reasons they are heavily concentrated is not so much because they prefer to, but often because the socio-economic reality that forces them to.
But you would like to see less segregation?
Well, absolutely. We would prefer to have a more diverse communities all around the country.
What's your reaction to that, Adam?
Well, I think, yes, we need a more diverse community, but what are the challenges that we have right now with certain organisations and the MCB is this kind of pushback against the government with its attempts to help young Muslims not go down on this journey of extremism. One of those things is the PREVENT strategy, and we often hear organisations like MCB often attacking the PREVENT strategy, and it's counterproductive and it's not going to help.
What do you say to that? Are you pushing against the PREVENT strategy?
Do we support the government to have initiatives to counter extremism and terrorism? Of course we do.
Do you support the PREVENT strategy?
We don't, and we're not alone. Our concern is it scapegoats a whole community, which is ultimately counterproductive.
Pauline Neville-Jones, the report shows that contrary to a lot of lone wolf theories and or people being radicalised in their bedrooms on the internet, that 80% of those convicted had connections with extremist groups like Al-Muhajirun, which you used to be a member of. Indeed, 25% were linked to that one organisation. Are we doing enough to neutralise these groups?
Well, some of them have been prescribed, of course. They change their names, they evolve. I think, in fact, this report, which is a very thorough piece of work, it charts a whole long period. And I think it's probably true to say that in the earlier stages, these organisations were very important. Of course, subsequently, we've had direct recruiting by IS, one-to-one over the internet. So I think we have a more mixed picture now of the way in which people are recruited. But there's no doubt that these organisations are recruiting sergeants.
You were once a member of one of these organisations. Are we doing enough to thwart them from being recruiting sergeants?
If we just focus on these organisations, then we will fail.
No, I'm not saying we're just focusing on them. I'm asking, though, the report says they are one factor. So I'm asking you, are we doing enough to neutralise them?
I think we are. I think that the government's strategy is in the right places and we're working enough. But I think that where we need to focus on is the Muslim community or the communities. What the Muslim community must do is realise that, yes, these violent extremists are fringe, but they share ideas, a broad spectrum of ideas that penetrate deeply within the Muslim communities, and we need to tackle those ideas because that's where it all begins.
Are you in favour of banning groups like Al-Muhajirun?
Yeah, I think it was a right thing to do, and I can also tell you that the community has moved a long way. Al-Muhajirun does not enjoy support in any community organisation or institutions. In fact, there are instances.
Is that right? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that, but that's just very simplistic, attacking Muhajirun. So we have to understand. Look, ISIS didn't bring about extremism. Extremism brought about ISIS. ISIS is just a brand. And if we don't deal with the fundamental theological ideas, then we will have other organisations popping up, rearing their ugly heads. The
report suggests that almost a quarter of Islamist-related terrorist offences were committed by individuals who were previously unknown to the security services. I mean, that would seem like it's... and that this is on the rise, these numbers. I mean, this would seem to make an already difficult task for our intelligence services almost impossible.
2 points. I mean, actually, it's even higher than three-quarters. It's over 80%, I think, were known, which shows that actually, the intelligence services and the police do have their... have got their eyes open.
But the trend has been towards more that they were not on the radar.
That is because, I think, as I've mentioned earlier, the nature of the recruitment has also changed. And you have much more ISIS-inspired, go out and do it yourself, get a knife, go and do something simple. So we have had fewer of the very big spectaculars that Al Qaeda used to organise, which you could track because they had to communicate.
Then they were on the radar.
Yeah, and now you've got much, locally organised people. Two, three people get together, do something together. Very, very much harder actually to get forewarning of that. That's where intelligence inside the community coming to the police to say, I am worried about my son, my daughter, his friends. This goes to the crux, it seems to me, of how you get ahead of that kind of attack.
Should people in the Muslim community who are worried about individuals being radicalised, perhaps going down the terrorist route, should they bring in the police, alert the authorities?
Absolutely, and we have been consistent in calling on the community that wherever they suspect that somebody may be involved in terrorism or any kind of criminal activity for that matter, they should call the police and cooperate.
Well, that's clear enough. As the so-called caliphate collapses in the Middle East, which clearly it is now, how worried should we be about British IS fighters returning here? What should we do about it?
Well, extremely worried. I mean, these returnees fall into three categories. We have the individuals that have become disillusioned with the ISIS state. You have the ones that have become disturbed, suffering something that is akin to PTSD. And then you have the dangerous that haven't disavowed their ideas and will have great reasons to perform and carry out. So what do we do? Well, anyone that comes in back to the government should be, obviously, evidence should be looked into about if they've committed any crimes. But all of those individuals that I've just mentioned, those categories, should all be referred to Channel, and they must be de-radicalised. We can't just leave them alone.
Will we be sure that we know when they come back in?
Well, that's very difficult to say. I can say.
So they could come in and we might not know.
Well, it's not for me to say that.
They're on the watch list, so that you've got a better chance. You've identified an individual. Well, this is where cooperation with intelligence services in other countries is absolutely crucial, because you need to know when somebody is approaching. And, of course, our border controls need to be good as well. I'm not saying that and I think the government would not say that nobody would ever slip through, but I do think that our ability actually to know when someone's coming and to stop them at the border, if not before, has improved.
Let me just ask you finally a very quick question there. It's an important one, though. How prepared, given your experience, how prepared are we for a Paris-style attack in a medium-sized provincial city?
The government has exercised this one. It started when I was Security Minister, and it has been taken seriously. The single biggest challenge that any police, and indeed the army in that instance, would face would be one of those mobile roving attacks.
Yes.
And the answer is you have to take it seriously, and the government does.
All right, we'd better leave it there for now, but I thank all three of you. Now, the Sunday Politics has had sight of a major new report into Islamist terrorism in the UK. This is it here. It's a 1,000-page study. Researchers say it's the most comprehensive ever produced. It's certainly very heavy. It analyses all 269 Islamist-related terrorist offences committed between 1998 and 2015. Most planned attacks were thankfully thwarted. But what can we learn from those offences? Here's Adam Fleming.
For the police and the intelligence agencies to fight terror, they need to know what it is. Researchers at the security think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, gave us early access to their huge new report, which analyses every Islamism-related attack and prosecution in the UK since 1998. That's 269 cases involving 253 perpetrators.
With issues as sensitive as counter-terrorism and counter-radicalisation, it's really important to have an evidence base from which you draw policy and policing, and that's exactly what this is. This isn't my opinion, this is the facts.
This chart shows the number of cases each year, combined with the small number of successful suicide attacks.